Writing well is hard. Without the benefit of body language or tone, you must take what lives in your head and compress it into words on the screen. But it is also a powerful skill. See, when you first start on the job, all you need to do is convince the person next to you that your code doesn't have bugs. And they're probably already pretty good at determining that by looking only at your code. As time goes on, you might be asked to plan a short project and pitch it to your team. And if they don't get it, your plan won't be chosen. As years go by, you'll start seeing problems that no one else does, and will need to explain them clearly to people around you who may not be as technical. Eventually, those plans and designs will become more complex while your audience becomes wider. You'll be speaking with other developers, but also designers and product managers and customers and executives. Without the ability to write clearly, you'll lose them. At a certain point, your ability to communicate well will become even more important than your technical ability. So, do you write well? I'm Raine, and today we're going to look at how you can use the writing you already do to become a better writer. If you make software for a living, chances are you write every day. It's one of the invisible things we're expected to do, and these words add up. This is the first page of The Great Gatsby, a novel from F. Scott Fitzgerald. At just over 200 words, it's around the same length as the commit messages, pull request write-ups, and code review comments you'll write over the next few days. After 3 years of work, you'll write the equivalent of the entire Great Gatsby novel, about 50,000 words. Over a career, you'll write more than the entire Lord of the Rings series, including The Hobbit, while on the job. So, if we're all writing a lot, why aren't we all excellent writers? According to the 10,000 hour rule, which explains how practice can lead to mastery, we should all be competent writers after a few years on the job, and good writers after 10 or so years. In 2018, a full 10 years after Outliers was published, its author Malcolm Gladwell explained this disconnect, why some people become better and others stay the same, by pointing to the quality of their practice.
So there's clearly a difference between one person's 10,000 hours and another person's 10,000 hours, right? And people who practice in a focused way, where they're getting ample feedback and they are working in a deliberate way on improving their areas of weakness, those people will tend to see far more improvement over their 10,000 hours than those who don't, than those who practice in a kind of sloppy way.
It's easy to let our writing practice become sloppy, and instead focus on something more concrete, like learning a new programming language or framework. But writing is one of those evergreen skills. No matter where you work or what you do, your ability to write well will be appreciated by those around you and help your voice cut through the noise. And with the explosion of remote work, your ability to communicate effectively with the written word has never been more important. Of all the writing you do in a week, a pull request write-up is probably the most demanding. It varies in size and structure, but the objective remains the same: explain your work. A good write-up can lead to faster code review and better feedback. A poor write-up can confuse your teammates and slow down your merge. This is the perfect place for deliberate practice. But often, by the time we're ready to open a pull request, we just want to move on to something else. What comes out often fits into one of three categories, starting with the nothing write-up. If you've ever reviewed a pull request like this recently, chances are you went straight to the code tab to figure out what it did. Sometimes that works fine, but other times the code may not tell the whole story, and you might miss something. In fact, this is probably the best way to sneak something past your reviewer. Or maybe you've seen a write-up like this, that isn't short but also doesn't tell you anything new. It might describe the code changes, but it leaves out why they were made in the first place, or it includes information that isn't relevant to you. This is actually worse than no write-up, because as a reviewer, you don't know if the write-up is useful until you read it. If it's not useful, you still need to figure out why the code change was made, so you go over to the code tab. Even worse, you may learn to ignore write-ups in the future, leading to a vicious cycle where no one reads write-ups because they're not useful, and so no one spends time on write-ups because no one reads them. And finally, the last PR write-up is noisy. It's a wall of text and code that includes useful information that's hard to understand mixed in with other information that isn't relevant. And it really makes you work for it. Like bad PR write-ups, good PR write-ups also have a shape, and they tend to look like this. So what does it take to make these write-ups look more like this write-up? Well, first we need to understand what we're doing and why. Writing at work is strangely inhuman. The topics are often complex and the tone often impersonal. We write things we would never want to read ourselves. And that leads us to the first thing to keep in mind when writing at work. Most readers would prefer not to have to read your document at all. Larry McInerney, the director of the University of Chicago's writing program, sums up the purpose of academic writing like this.
Why are they reading? Because they think it's valuable to them. Yeah, your writing needs to be clear, sure. Your writing needs to be organized. Yes, your writing needs to be persuasive, but more than anything else, from now on, your writing needs to be valuable. Because if it's not that, nothing else matters.
And I think that applies to what we do as well. It's not like a novel or a movie. After a new movie comes out, you don't rush off to Wikipedia to read the plot summary because you don't really care about the plot. You care about the experience. You care about the popcorn and hanging out with friends. But when you write at work, it's different. Your readers aren't interested in an experience. They're interested in the value you can provide. And the easier you make it for them, the better. If they get lost while reading, they'll grow impatient and skim, or they'll stop reading altogether. But this is at odds with our tendency to change how we sound at work. We become more technical and less friendly. We replace simple words with fancy ones, and we exchange action for passivity. It leads to sentences like this. Participants were tested under conditions of good to excellent acoustic isolation. While I understand the words, I can't process the meaning until I rewrite it in my head. We tested the students in a quiet room. Unlike the first message, the second message is efficient. As quickly as we read the words, we understand what they mean. This kind of writing puts the reader first, and it makes it easy for them to understand what is being said. In the workplace where the reader reads to be informed, this kind of writing is ideal. But contrary to its effortless form, clear writing isn't easy to create. And the first problem is an unexpected one. You know too much. When you sit down to write a piece, there's a good chance you know more about it than the reader. After puzzling over a bug for a few hours, all the details about what happened and how to fix it are fresh in your mind. And like a professor teaching a first-year computer science class to kids at a high school, it creates an imbalance. In the early 90s, a psychologist at Stanford named Elizabeth Newton ran an experiment to explore this kind of asymmetry between two people. She divided 80 students into two groups, tappers and listeners. Tappers were given a list of well-known songs like Happy Birthday and Jingle Bells and asked to pick a song and tap it with their finger on the table for one of the listeners. Before they began to tap, they were asked to estimate how likely it was that the listener would correctly identify the song. On average, the tappers thought 50% of the listeners would guess the tune, but after 120 trials, only 3 songs were correctly identified. That's only 2.5%. Even the most pessimistic tapper thought at least 10% of the listeners would guess correctly. So why were the tappers so optimistic? If you're the one tapping on the table, the song is playing in your head. Because of what you know, when you tap the rhythm to Happy Birthday on the table, it's hard to imagine someone not recognizing the pattern. It just seems so obvious. But as the listener would tell you, it's not so easy being on the other side. This is the curse of knowledge, and it may explain why good people write bad prose. If you've ever asked for directions in a strange city, you've probably experienced what it's like to be the listener. You're hearing the words, but they're just not sticking. Meanwhile, the person who is explaining it to you is vividly imagining themselves turning each corner. This shows up in work almost every day. When it comes time to explain what you've done, what comes out misses many of the steps you needed to take to understand the problem in the first place. Reversing this effect is challenging, even when you're aware of it. A good rule of thumb is to assume your readers know less about the subject than you think they do. Even when the reader is familiar with the subject, they'll often find a brief refresher of terms and jargon to be helpful because it brings their existing knowledge to the forefront. Another cause is relying too much on abstractions. As we learn something, our brain exchanges concrete examples into concepts. These are easier for us to recall and act as shorthand when speaking with somebody else who is also familiar with the concept. Rather than say, you've duplicated the same code in 3 different places and it's probably a good time to extract it into a separate method, you just say, can you dry this up? This saves time so long as you're speaking with someone who can easily recall what dry means. If they can't, you've lost them. Working in a field so tightly packed with abstraction, concrete examples can be a much needed break for your readers. Instead of writing, this will prevent an attack vector where we add so many items that it causes issues in the UI. Swap the abstract terms for concrete equivalents. This stops people from making the page slow by limiting the number of items that can be added. In other words, concrete is better than abstract. When you can't avoid abstractions, lean heavily on examples. This will fill gaps in the reader's knowledge by providing a second or third perspective on a concept. If you've ever read the documentation on Rails, you've benefited from a healthy reliance on examples. See if you can make sense of this method from active record without the code example. Removes an unwanted relation that is already defined on a chain of relations. While I think I know what that means, I'm a bit fuzzy on the details, and I'm not sure if I really know what a chain of relations is. But add a code example and it's a different story. This is the same as that. Easy. In other words, examples can make abstractions appear concrete. But perhaps the best way to avoid the curse of knowledge is to describe step by step how a process or a bug or a system works. For example, when opening a PR with a bug fix, instead of explaining what you did to fix the bug, bring the reader through the experience. How was the bug triggered? Why does it occur? And what other fixes did you try? Then, after explaining all of that, explain what you did and why it worked. This is effective for 2 reasons. First, it forces you to prove to yourself that you know how it works. Gaps in your understanding become way more obvious the more you write. In fact, our ability to reason about a topic increases when we write about that thing. And you can use this to catch problems in your work. For me, writing detailed commit messages is one of the most reliable ways I know to find my mistakes. Second, walking through a process step by step helps bring the reader through the same sequence of events that made the concept clear to you. If you needed those steps, chances are your reader does too. If you follow this pattern, you'll find that your writing builds on itself sequentially. In a perfectly crafted piece, each sentence will provide information that informs the reader while raising new questions in their mind that is then answered by the next sentence. This creates momentum that tugs the reader along. Here's an example from a recent pull request that added a new feature to GitHub. You can now create markdown code blocks quickly using a keyboard shortcut. Okay, cool, I learned something new. Now, how do I use it? To use it, highlight some text, then hit Command E. Perfect, but what about multi-line blocks? If you highlight more than one line, you'll get a multi-line code block. Otherwise, you'll get an inline code block. But ideas rarely flow from your mind to the keyboard in the way best understood by the reader. So unless you're part of the fortunate few who can write perfectly on the first go, get ready to edit. When writing software, we rarely get things right in one go. To offset our imperfection, we refactor early and often. each time making the code better for our future selves. And many of us relish this activity. It's a kind of spring cleaning for our code, to go from messy to clean, from disorganized to tidy. If you rely on refactoring, it usually goes something like this. First, write something that runs. The variable names can be nonsense, the performance can be awful, it can break all the rules in the book so long as it gets the job done. Once there, we refactor and transform that mess into something we're proud of. In Bird by Bird, Anne Lamont describes a similar process for writing fiction.
The other thing I really believe in is writing really, really shitty first drafts. I know a lot of writers, and none of them write good first drafts. They write really frighteningly bad first drafts. I don't think you can know what you're doing until you're probably a whole draft through it.
Those shitty first drafts lead to good second drafts and terrific third drafts. William Zinsser takes it further in his classic book on nonfiction writing by showing 2 pages from the final manuscript peppered with marks and revisions. Even after being rewritten 5 or 6 times, it could still be made tighter, stronger, and more precise. This repeated refinement is the key to writing well. A relentless pursuit of improvement that eventually produces work worth keeping. If you know how to refactor, you already know this process. You take something that works, but not well, you find a shortcoming, and you apply a transformation to make it better. And repeat. Just like we would with code, let's look at 3 ways we can refactor our words. Good writing is compact. Every word earns its place. The first draft is yours. Be as wordy as you like, but then comes the axe. Or as Stephen King's first editor, John Gould, put it,
when you write a story, you're telling yourself the story. When you rewrite, your main job is taking out all the things that are not the story.
My wife and I recently moved into a new home, but before we did, the builder emailed us an update. At this point in time, we are currently awaiting an on-site inspection by a local trades representative to ensure recent changes to the electrical system will support the new appliance package. The new appliance package can't be delivered until they sign off on the new work. Or, in other words, your fridge will arrive later than expected. Clutter can make the most important parts of your work disappear into a wall of text. Like with your code, sometimes the best thing you can do is delete. You can often cut up to 50% of the content without losing any information. This is one of my favorite parts of writing because hitting delete is easy and it can make a jumble of words into something lean and confident. So let's declutter a pull request. This PR fixes the author filter dropdown, which appears on the issues page. When I tried to reproduce it locally, it wasn't working at first, and then I tried on production and I didn't see it either. I almost closed the issue as won't fix, but then Ben pointed out that the bug only occurs when logged in as a pro user. With this new information, I was able to reproduce the problem. After some fiddling and other local environment problems, I was able to fix the issue by updating how we retrieve the user's handle. The fix is a bit repetitive, but at this point in time, because of the differences in user types, I think it seems appropriate. When decluttering, there are 3 things to watch for, starting with phrases that aren't relevant to your reader. The first sentence provides useful information about what the PR does, so we'll keep it. The next 2 sentences tell about how difficult it was to reproduce the issue. If you've spent time working on a bug, this is definitely relevant and important information to you, but it may not be relevant to your reviewer. So let's get rid of it. There is this one bit they'll be interested in though. This bug only happens for pro users. The next 2 sentences also provide useful information, so we'll keep those too. Next, it's time to remove phrases that don't provide any information at all. Instead of writing, I'm aware of the fact that, write, I know, rather than writing, due to the fact that, write, because. If something is redundant, we can leave it out altogether. So the reader knows they're looking at a PR, so no need to remind them of this here. Also, this reads fine without these extra words, so we can remove them. And in the last sentence, it's safe to assume that we're talking about the present, so we can drop this phrase. And lastly, let's remove any words that hedge. This one is really hard. And sometimes you should hedge, but probably not as much as you think. And when you remove these words, your writing will become easier to understand. And if you do find yourself uncomfortable removing a qualifier, it may be a sign that you shouldn't be saying that thing at all. Okay, so after some chopping, we've cut more than half of the words, and I would much rather read our shorter version. But a word of warning, be careful that in your effort to declutter, you don't make your writing less clear. Being so terse, the reader may get lost. Or rather, if you are too terse, the reader may get lost. Now, removing clutter is a good start, but it won't make confusing writing any better. Reading should be an effortless glide from sentence to sentence, but what you'll often find is bumps along the way that slow you down or stop you in your tracks, like this sentence. Your brain may be throwing a syntax error, but I promise it's a completely valid sentence. As we read from left to right, our brains parse the sentence like Ruby parses code. And when we see old before man, we read it as an adjective and noun, but then the rest of the sentence doesn't make sense. We don't have a slot for the boat. Now this happens because of syntactic ambiguities. Man can be a noun or a verb, and we've interpreted it wrong. But if we swap out the ambiguous parts, it now makes sense. And English gives us plenty of room to confuse readers. Like this one. Or this one. These are called garden paths, as in to lead someone up the garden path. And less extreme versions of this show up in writing all the time. Try reading this one in your head. When you were reading, did you double back on it or pause to make sense of what you had just read? How about this revised version? In your own writing, you may find these easy to miss because the curse of knowledge keeps them from you. You know the path too well. But with some effort, you'll spot them again. As you reread, become sensitive to that feeling of doubling back or thinking too hard to understand your sentence. Once you find a garden path, it's time to add a signpost that can guide your reader. In some cases, all it takes is a single word. I convinced her that children are noisy. Or offset the phrase with commas. Cotton, which clothing is made from, is grown in Egypt. Or if it isn't essential, drop the phrase entirely. Cotton is grown in Egypt. Other times, it requires more serious revision. But even after the garden paths have been closed up, there's still plenty of snags to catch our reader. Take, for example, this sentence from earlier. Participants were tested under conditions of good to excellent acoustic isolation. Let's make it better. If we focus on the first half of the sentence, there's something missing. Participants were tested, but who is doing the testing? There's no actor, so let's add one in. Participants were tested by us. That's sort of better, but now something else stands out. The sentence is backwards. This is the passive voice, and it'll sneak into your work and it'll kill your momentum. Rather than saying, I did it, we said, it was done by me. Or even worse, we drop the actor entirely and say, it was done. In this most basic form, it sounds painfully obvious, but how about these examples? The change that broke the page was shipped last week. Or these two. A SQL injection vulnerability was exploited to gain access to private data. This clever feature was suggested by a few beta testers. There's a ghostly quality to these phrases. Even in the last example, when we have people in the sentence, those beta testers, there's a distinct absence. If we change them to active voice, last week we shipped a change that broke the page. Malicious users exploited a SQL injection to gain access to private data. A few beta testers suggested this clever feature. We can watch the people do the thing, and it becomes much easier to follow. So if we reverse the order of our original sentence, we tested the participants, it finally flows. Okay, back to the rest of the sentence. We tested the participants under conditions of good to excellent acoustic isolation. The sentence still drags. It's this bit, good to excellent acoustic isolation. Helen Sword, a writing expert and teacher, calls these zombie nouns because they lumber across the scene without a conscious actor directing their motion. And they'll bring your sentences to a crawl. They come from verbs like create and adjectives like slow or visible. You can create your own zombie nouns if you'd like by adding suffixes like this. Create becomes creation, slow becomes slowness, visible becomes visibility. And it results in sentences like draft pull request creation will result in a server error. Here we've combined both passive voice and zombie nouns to make something simple sound complicated. Now that's great if you want to convince someone your work is complex, but terrible if you want somebody to review your work. If we revise it, it becomes much better. How about this one? Users are experiencing slowness on the issues page, which becomes the issue page is slow. Okay, back in our original sentence, we can trade out the zombie noun for something specific and concrete. We tested the participants in a quiet room. Much better. Now, once your sentences are tight and clear, it's time to zoom out and look at your flow. Every sentence in every paragraph should feel like walking down a slight incline. As you finish one, you slip easily into the next paragraph and on and on. But it often does not work that way. Take, for example, this overstuffed sentence from one of my pull requests. Setting Rails env to development by default in local environments will break some default behaviors in vanilla Rails applications, which expect Rails env not to be set in development and instead pick a value depending on what task is being run. For example, development when running a server, or test when running tests, or sometimes both, like when running migrations. In an effort to be concise, I've lost the reader. I've stuffed 5 sentences worth of information into one long sentence. When you're writing, be sure to give your ideas room to breathe. Now, at first, this may seem at odds with our efforts to declutter, but length isn't everything. When your writing has room to breathe, even if it is longer, it's going to be easier to understand. So let's fix this. Starting from the top to bottom, there are 6 pieces of information, all smushed together. That's a lot to ask the reader to hold in their head. So once you know what you're going to say, make sure the ideas are in the right order. You can pick whatever order makes most sense. It could be chronological, going from cause to effect, going from problem to cause to solution, or something else. So long as the reader can follow you and that you're consistent. Here we'll go from cause to effect, starting with a fact that can stand alone. Rails doesn't need Rails env to be set during development or test. And on from there, ending in the crux of the entire paragraph, setting Rails env to development will break default behaviors. In the original, this was presented first, but we didn't have enough information to understand it or know the implications. But now, with reordering and breaking into different sentences, this flows more naturally, and when the reader lands here, they know what it means. So once you know what you'd like to say and in what order, it's time to experiment. See if you can combine related ideas. You can do this with dashes to inject information, or create lists to combine related topics together, or use a colon to draw together two sequential but related ideas. If one idea is more important than the others, keep it separate and keep it short to emphasize it. After some playing, I landed on this. Rails doesn't expect RailsEnv to be set during development. Instead, it picks the environment based on the commands you run. When you run Rails server, it defaults to development, and when you run Rails test, it defaults to test. In special cases, like when running Rails DB migrate, it will run in both test and development modes. But be careful. Setting RailsEnv when working locally will break these default behaviors. It's now 5 sentences and about 10 more words than the first. It may not be the best form, but it's certainly easier to understand. The information flows from simple to complex, and it leads to a definite conclusion. And finally, be sure to make the most of the medium. This is your canvas. You have a title and a markdown space. You can add headers, links, screenshots, videos. And when it comes to your title, don't settle for the first thing that comes to mind. Treat it like the lead of your story. In Nora Ephron's book, she recounts a time from high school when she learned how to write a lead.
My high school journalism teacher is teaching us to write a lead, the first sentence or paragraph of a newspaper story. He writes the words who, what, where, when, why, and how on the blackboard. Then he dictates a set of facts to us that goes something like this. Kenneth L. Peters, the principal of Beverly Hills High School, announced today that the faculty of the high school will travel to Sacramento on Thursday for a colloquium in new teaching methods. Speaking there will be anthropologist Margaret Mead and Robert Maynard Hutchins, the president of the University of Chicago. We all sit at our typewriters and write a lead, most of us inverting the set of facts so that they read something like this. Anthropologist Margaret Mead and University of Chicago President Robert Maynard Hutchins will address the faculty Thursday in Sacramento at a colloquium on new teaching methods. The principal of the high school, Kenneth L. Peters, announced today. We turn in our leads. We're very proud. Mr. Sims looks at what we've done and then tosses everything into the garbage. He says, the lead to the story is, there will be no school Thursday.
It's so easy to lose sight of the important parts when you've been spelunking deep within the codebase. But it's important to pull your head up and remember that you're not adding a keyboard shortcut. You're making it easier for people to insert code blocks. And when you fix a bug, you're not fixing a no method error on nil. You're fixing the checkout for users who haven't filled out their zip code. In the first paragraph or so of your pull request, put all the essential information that somebody would need to understand what you did and why. You don't need to be technical. You just need to help them understand why it is that they should read the rest of your PR or care if it gets merged into main. After your lead is written, your title is filled out, take all the remaining relevant information, the details on how to reproduce the bug or the benefits of the new feature or the limitations of your implementation, and organize them under informative headings. These headings should be long enough to be useful without being wordy. You want your reader to be able to skim to find the important parts quickly. And then, once everything is in place, if there's anything visual about the work that you can capture, do it. A single screenshot or short GIF will do wonders to help your reviewer see what you're seeing. If it's difficult to capture it in a single frame, record a short screencast. 10 or 15 seconds is all it takes. It gives you a chance to speak directly to the reader. Now, this is huge because you get to walk somebody through as if you're sitting together, and some things are best captured with video. After all that work, you'll land on something that looks like this. It's clear and confident. It's human. It has rhythm and momentum. It starts simple and moves towards complex. It's concrete and full of examples. It makes the most of the medium with links, code blocks, and screenshots. But most of all, it's valuable to the reader. It makes the person who reviews your code happy because it makes their job easier. It makes your manager happy because it's easy to show off your work. And it makes you happy because when you eventually come back to figure out why you did that thing, it'll be obvious. So, when you sit down to write your next pull request, be deliberate. Treat it like you treat code and refactor it. And one day, as you look back at an old pull request, you'll find that you've become an excellent writer. If you enjoyed this talk, join us in the live Q&A on Wednesday at 4:40 p.m. Eastern Time, or say hello to me on Twitter at @JNRaine. You can also visit refactoringwords.com for a cheat sheet of some of the tips that I talked about in this video. And also, if you really want to dive deep into writing, there are so many good books on this. I've listed the books that I used for this talk here. I stole everything from people who are smarter than me, and you should too. Thank you so much for watching, and have a good rest of the conference.